Welcome. Come right in. You can't afford to miss this.
Yeah, Operation Mindfuck was too successful. Yeah, the Jetsons on DMT it. Yeah, the Jetsons on DMT it. Yeah, the Jetsons on DMT it.
Sirius.
I'm already Sirius, and this is my show. This is my show indeed, and we've been having so much luck in the studio today. I just have a feeling about this show that it's going to strafe you. It's going to fuck your head up. Every second, every breath, every moment of this show is going to change your life. It's going to make you a billionaire. It's going to start the revolution. It's going to do things to you you've never imagined before. Or maybe not.
Are you serious?
Last week on the Weekend Edition, we had a discussion about whether philosophy is still meaningful. In my humble opinion, if America has a valuable philosopher today, his name is Robert Anton Wilson. Today we'll be talking about Wilson with several extraordinary guests.
Light goes on. No robot machine has ever been accused of being absent-minded or careless at its work.
We're here with Lance Bosher. He's the director of the documentary film Maybe Logic, The Lives and Ideas of Robert Anton Wilson, and his company, Deep Leaf Productions, runs the Maybe Logic Academy, a very fine online academy, if I may say so, inspired by Robert Anton Wilson. They have instructors like Douglas Rushkoff, Eric Davis, Antaro Ali, and I've done a couple of things there myself. And his current and upcoming films include the multimedia project Utopia USA, the Robert Anton Wilson musical Wilhelm Reich in Hell, and a documentary about a 5-year-old noise rock drummer and his band Monster Dudes. And unfortunately, I don't think we're going to get a chance to talk about Monster Dudes today, but it sounds great, and I'd like to have you back. And you also have the first audio release of the Illuminators Trilogy, something that our many RAW fan listeners will be excited to hear. And so welcome, Lance.
Thanks for having me.
I want to just start off real basic and real simple. How did you get into Robert Anton Wilson? How did you discover him?
Let's see. I think a friend of mine just gave me one of his books. I think it was Prometheus Rising, and blew my mind. And I think read just about every book thereafter in sequential order over a couple of years. And kind of became kind of obsessed, and I just loved it. It was just, kind of really spoke to me. And so I've been a fan for a long time. Did it speak to your point of view about the world, or did it change how you looked at the world? It's hard to say. It certainly spoke to my point of view about the world. I've always been kind of a skeptic and looking for multiple perspectives on any one thing. And so, and Bob, that's in my opinion anyway, is kind of the center of what Bob is really all about, and all of his work, fiction and non-fiction alike. So that part of it I love. But he's just entertaining too. Really funny, humorous work, which I think some people forget.
The writing is always fun and very lively. You will not be bored reading Robert Anton Wilson. I think Tom Robbins called it a tilt-a-whirl, a kind of circus of consciousness. And Wilson perhaps doesn't get treated by the mainstream as a serious writer because his writing is perhaps so carnivalesque, and although there's certainly some respect for magic realism and all these different sorts of things, he's like sort of right in the thick of the counterculture changes that have happened in the 60s and the 70s, and it seems like the mainstream reviewers have never given him the cred that he deserves.
Yeah, that's right. And it's always been a little bit of a mystery to me why that is, but Bob takes on drugs head on. A lot of writers, I think, kind of veer away from that, and Bob just goes right into it and has a lot of fun with it. And his politics is on the edge. Really, Bob's on the edge of a lot of things. He is feminists didn't like him for a time there. He kind of has a way to offend everyone. So I think maybe that's one of the reasons anyway that he hasn't really caught on in a mainstream kind of way.
well, he dares to think about things rather than just accept the. So I mean, he as I recall, he questioned some aspects of feminist thinking, which was just sort of woman good, man bad kind of simplicity. And
Bob seems to have kind of a real sensitivity. The minute he hears dogma, it's just his alarms go off, and wherever he sees it, he attacks it. And so whether it's feminism or the left or the right in politics, it doesn't really make a difference. When he sees that kind of just rigid mindset, he'll go right at it.
Some of us have just recently got an email from Robert Anton Wilson, and we want to let everybody know that he's very much alive. And of course, there was some word out on the net and in the general community that he was slowing down a bit, and that he needed some monetary assistance to get through this period of time. And I think it's really important to say that Robert Anton Wilson is a very successful writer, and he was a very successful lecturer, and he has a very substantial audience, and he has done very well. And some people may get the wrong idea. The fact that he needed to go out and, to get the word out, to get some capital together. Some people may not understand the economics of being a writer and a lecturer, and also just how expensive things are. And you made a film about him. Talk about how many people out there are who appreciate him. And
thousands. I mean, I think Illuminatus has sold, 150,000 copies or so. I mean, he has a lot of fans, and and one thing it's also telling, Illuminatus, it's been out for 30 plus years, and it still sells 10,000 plus copies a year.
Right.
So for some reason, his stuff has a kind of timeless quality to it, even though it really was kind of knee deep in the 60s. I mean, he was really in that mentality and explored the kind of changes that went on at that time. But there's a timelessness to it. And I think one thing that's unique, it's not just the numbers, it's the way that he influences and reaches readers. He really changes people.
To me, that's what happened. When I read Wilson, it definitely changed my perspective. And that was way back in the mid-1970s. Definitely opened me up to some of the same areas that I'm still exploring on these podcasts, and that I explored through Mondo 2000 and so forth. Let's pause for a moment and hear a reading from the man himself. Lance, describe what we have here to listen to.
This is a reading. Well, we're releasing Illuminatus, an audiobook early next year, and the first book, Eye in the Pyramid, is Ken Campbell and Chris Fairbank is doing the reading. And Ken Campbell was the one who put Illuminatus on the stage in England back in the late 70s. And so I revisited him and got him to read it. So this is Ken Campbell doing the introduction to the book.
Are you serious?
It was the year when they finally immanentized the eschaton. On April the 1st, the world's great powers came closer to nuclear war than ever before, all because of an obscure island named Fernando Po. By the time international affairs returned to their normal Cold War level, some wits were calling it the most tasteless April Fool's joke in history. I happen to know all the details about what happened, but I have no idea how to recount them in a manner that will make sense to most readers. For instance, I'm not even sure who I am, and my embarrassment on that matter makes me wonder if you will believe anything I reveal. Worse yet, I am at the moment very conscious of a squirrel in Central Park, just off 68th Street in New York City, that is leaping from one tree to another. And I think that happens on the night of April the 23rd, or is it the morning of April the 24th? But fitting the squirrel together with Fernando Po is, for the present, beyond my powers. I beg your tolerance. There is nothing I can do to make things any easier for any of us, and you will have to accept being addressed by a disembodied voice just as I accept the compulsion to speak out, even though I am painfully aware that I am talking to an invisible, perhaps non-existent audience. Wise men have regarded the earth as a tragedy, a farce, even an illusionist's trick. But all, if they are truly wise and not merely intellectual rapists, recognize that it is certainly some kind of stage in which we all play roles, most of us being very poorly coached and totally unrehearsed before the curtain rises. Is it too much if I ask tentatively that we agree to look upon it as a circus? A touring carnival wandering about the sun for a record season of 4 billion years and producing new monsters and miracles, hoaxes and bloody mishaps, wonders and blunders, but never quite entertaining the customers well enough to prevent them from leaving one by one and returning to their homes for a long and bored winter's sleep under the dust. Then say, for a while at least, that I have found an identity as ringmaster. But that crown sits uneasily on my head, if I have a head. And I must warn you that the troupe is small for a universe this size, and many of us have to double or triple our stints. So you can expect me back in many other guises. Indeed, do many things come to pass?
Are you serious?
We're back. It's wonderful to hear that material. And in the film, maybe like in the sort of auxiliary film, maybe Logic, I talked about the Wilson's optimism, and I said, well, no, I myself am not as optimistic as he is. And then when I interviewed him for Neophiles, the text-based Neophiles site, he said that he didn't have the luxury of pessimism because he had had polio when he was young. And if he had been pessimistic, he would never have gotten up, but he willed himself to walk. And I think that sense of will and that love of being alive and that optimism still manifests today. And I know that he has a community around him in Santa Cruz who is very much inspired by him. Talk a little bit about Robert as a person who conveys a very strong life force.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there's quite a group of friends and family around Bob in Santa Cruz. Bob has had kind of a movie night, an ongoing movie night at his house for the last several years, at least 5 years. And then he has a book group every Wednesday that meets with him. And so there's people really just love to just be with Bob, and then they could actually get to read his work is quite extraordinary. But yeah, Bob is just his optimism and energy is just not flagged one bit. Even when he was really at death's door, I think this summer, he didn't think he was dying. Everyone else really did because he was so weak. But once again, I've seen it for years and years, watching Bob's optimism at work. And he really, it's a real thing for him. And as you said, it's very pragmatic. He really has to. It's not just like a luxury, like I'm going to be happy. Like he has to work on it like everyone else does. But I've seen it in work over and over again. It's quite extraordinary.
Yeah, I think he may make it to the singularity before I do. You never know. Wilson, I think, told me that the name Maybe Logic for your institute actually came from you. Wasn't his idea, but it comes from a statement that he made, which is the universe contains a maybe. And talk a little bit about that phrase and how it's inspired this institute.
Yeah, well, it's a multi-valued logic. So instead of the Aristotelian either or even a 3 or 4 valued logic, it's kind of an infinite logic. So whenever you're looking at any particular, whether it's a problem or an insight or perspective, you attempt to look at it in many different ways. And Bob certainly does that. I mean, in one of his greatest books, I think, Cosmic Trigger, he actually shows the different Robert Anton Wilsons that looked at the kind of mysteries that he was confronted with in that time period, and the different Bobs, really looked at them in a different way, and he lived different lives So that's part of it. But I didn't coin the phrase. I forget actually who did. A mathematician, I think, used it first years and years ago. I just picked up on it because I just saw it as a thread that is woven through everything that Bob has done. So I just kind of took that and ran with it.
Related to that, I think, is the idea of E prime. Describe E prime.
Yeah, E prime is really interesting. This is from Korzybski, who was a scientist in the, I guess, 30s. He was publishing a lot of stuff in the 20s.
Science and Sanity.
Science and Sanity was his big work, I think 33. Yeah. And Bob was influenced. Bob read this, I think, when he was in his early 20s, and it really just shook his whole consciousness. And so anyway, E prime is not using the verb is, or in any of its forms, was, or even will be, because it is, you're trying to make something more tangible than it actually is, right? So if you have you're looking at something and say Beethoven seems like the greatest composer of all time, it really changes your mind, your mindset. And Bob has used this. Even in his books, he's wrote whole books without the verb is in it. And it's quite extraordinary to see what it does to your own thinking.
So all of us better stick apart in this war against certainty. We're here with Eric Wagner. He's the author of An Insider's Guide to Robert Anton Wilson. Wagner has worked as a computer programmer and a teacher, among other things. And welcome, Eric.
Hello, sir.
And let's talk about the RAW as a writer. Would you compare him to any other writer? In many ways, he's very much off on his own. But would you make a comparison, and would you ascribe any kind of tradition or genre to his work?
Well, I think you can see him in a lot of lights. He's learned a lot from writers within the canon, like Joyce and Pound, but he has a very populist feel. In some ways, he reminds me of someone like Robert Heinlein, who plays a lot of literary games, but is definitely writing towards a mass audience, although Bob Wilson hasn't discovered his yet. I think Wilson brings a lot of different trajectories to his writing. You also see him playing with word games like Aleister Crowley, deriving a lot from genre writers like Raymond Chandler and H.P. Lovecraft, and I think that gives him a very unique style.
Yeah, that's a lovely combination there. Now you see Chandler perhaps in the Illuminators Trilogy, and then you see Lovecraft perhaps more than anything else in Masks of the Illuminati, among other things.
Oh, absolutely.
And he's covered territory similar to the territory covered by Umberto Eco on one extreme and Dan Brown on the other extreme. And how would you describe his interest in secret societies and how that impacts on his work as a writer?
Well, it really makes me think about his comments about Ulysses by Joyce. He thought that Ulysses explored the realm of neurological relativism, how each nervous system perceives reality in a different way. And I think Bob looked at the world of secret societies as a sociologist, seeing how to one person, last Tuesday's election might seem like a great triumph of democracy. Another person might see secret Jewish bankers behind it. Someone else knows that it's all about the covering up of the Roswell incident. And the rest of us really know it was the Easter Bunny.
Right, exactly. So, this is his, in some sense, it's his way of playing with reality in the same way that, say, the magic realists in Latin America played with reality and so forth. He uses the secret societies to engage in a kind of cosmic surrealism, and as well as anthropology.
Yeah, and I think it's very pointed in that he wants to look at how the individual human nervous system creates so much of what it perceives, whereas the surrealists, I think, might have been going off on a number of other tangents. Bob keeps coming back to the individual and how the individual shapes their own perceptions.
You've said, are you saying his book, in your book, that his work has improved over the years? Talk a little bit about how you see the evolution of his writing.
Well, it seems to me when Bob went through his sort of spiritual awakening in 73, 74, which he describes in Cosmic Trigger, I think that his prose took a first jump there. If you look at early works like, excuse me, the original Book of the Breast and the original Sex and Magics and the Playboy Book of Forbidden Words, and then you read Illuminatus, I think that he was rewriting Illuminatus at that point, and it seems to me there's a stylistic jump. Then he continues. He was involved with the Physics Consciousness Research Group in Berkeley in the late 70s. And again, he was dealing with a lot of personal tragedy, and those two sort of alchemically came together, and I think another jump with the Schrödinger's Cat trilogy and Mass Illuminati. Then with his move to Ireland, his deep study of Jonathan Swift, he went through and read all of Jonathan Swift's works, as well as his continued interest in Joyce. I think he came to a whole nother level of humor in books like Nature's God and The New Inquisition, which I know he said is his favorite of his nonfiction books. And then in the early 90s, he came back to his lifelong interest in general semantics and became fascinated with E prime. And I think that led to a whole another depth to his prose style, which you can see in Cosmic Trigger 2 and 3 and in Quantum Psychology.
I was fascinated to discover the Swiftian influence and how deeply he got into Swift while he was in Ireland, because you definitely see the cutting nature of his satire amplified over the years. And I thought perhaps he was just getting pissed off because the world keeps on getting weirder and weirder. But there's definitely a literary influence involved in bringing the satirical aspects to the fore, apparently.
I agree with you on that. And I think, again, he gets angry, and then he sort of laughs at himself for getting angry at typical primate behavior as he sees the absurdities of the 90s and the last few years. And so, again, he has these rages that disappear quickly and reemerge, and his humor keeps going on. And again, his lifelong interest in Joyce, I think, continues to serve him well to deal with this constant ebb and flow of compassion and humor and anger in his writing.
How has his work affected you personally?
That's a wonderful question. I can't really imagine. I first really got into him, about 82. And I remember as I was reading about the 6th or 7th book of his, I realized if I keep reading this guy, he's going to change my perceptions about everything. So it's hard to know where I would have turned 23, 24 years ago if I hadn't gotten deeply into Dr. Wilson's view of things. Like Timothy Leary, I think that Bob constantly encourages people to think for themselves and to question everything, including especially questioning him. And so that gives one sort of a constantly moving platform to view the world, which can be disconcerting sometimes. But certainly I feel that in my life I've hopefully become more forgiving and have developed a better sense of humor from studying Dr. Wilson all these years.
And has he introduced you to any particularly interesting works of literature or films? He's quite generous about posting on his website and elsewhere, and he used to do something called Trajectories, a published sheet where he's quite generous about introducing people to other works. And has he brought other works into your life?
Oh, absolutely. No question. I think that he's very good in, he's described himself as more a popularizer than anything else. Although I think that he probably does more than that. But he's looked at radical developments in quantum mechanics, in film, and in poetry and literature, and helped people to see their importance. I remember Tim Leary talked about how jazz of the 1920s helped to popularize quantum mechanics and the idea of not a linear mode of reality, but multiple competing things happening at once, which he saw in jazz. I think that in the same way, Wilson could see parallels between physics and especially Pound and Joyce. And through Bob's guidance, I think I've learned a lot about Pound and Joyce over the years and seen their continuing relevance.
he does go have an extraordinary knowledge of Ezra Pound and James Joyce. How would you describe Pound's influence on him?
Well, it seems to me Ezra Pound cared more about teaching writing than any other great writer in history. And certainly Pound can seem a very infuriating, racist, horrible person sometimes. But he also has this great desire to help people lead decent lives. And that may sound a little trite and moralistic, but Pound wrote books like ABC of Reading and How to Read that helped teach Bob how to write. And it's interesting because you see people like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac and William Burroughs also learning to write in part from Ezra Pound. Also, Allen Ginsberg made the comment about Pound that Pound put his whole life on paper. The cantos tell all of his rages, all of his loves, etc., through a long and strange life. And I think that stylistically, Bob has talked about learning more from Pound than from anybody else. And I think about how to get his life down on paper. Now, Bob has talked about learning that from William Faulkner as well. Also, a lot of Bob's ideas about the goddess, about the importance of writers like Shakespeare and Chaucer and Ovid, which he wrote about in Trajectories, definitely come back to his lifetime love of Ezra Pound.
Yes, Pound, we've some of the same mythological material into his work. I want to bring everybody in here for the end of the show and just go around, maybe starting right here to my left with my co-host for the day, Will Block, and just ask what's your favorite Robert Anton Wilson book and why?
Well, I'd have to say that Cosmic Trigger, on one hand, was my introduction to Wilson's work. And it broadened the way that I looked at the world. I was so captured by both the tragedy that underlies the telling of the tale, and again, as it was said earlier, the differences in the way that the world can be looked at. However, on the other hand, one of my favorites is certainly the Sigismundo series. I've had great fun with that.
And you're talking about the trilogy that began with
The Earth Will Shake.
The
Earth Will Shake as just being a totally brilliant and enticing tale of that connects more views of the world than I had previously thought were possible to put into a story. One last thing I have to comment on, Masks of the Illuminati. That book is the Wilson book I've read more than any other that I've come back to again and again. Probably because it calls out to the cinematographer in me. It's so kinesthetic, so multi-dimensional sensually.
It's interesting. There was a movie, I can't remember the name of it, by Nicholas Roeg that involved Marilyn Monroe and Albert Einstein in a hotel room. That always reminded me a little bit of Mask. Thanks for that. Yes, Insignificance, a marvelous film in and of itself. Lance Bosher, why don't you tell us what your favorite Robert Anton Wilson book is and why?
Cosmic Trigger is probably my favorite. I mean, I think it really captures the humanity of Bob, while he's just a brilliant guy and can bring in so many different parts of the conversation, from Pound and conspiracy theories, and there's just so much to him. Just Bob Wilson as a man he's quite an extraordinary figure, and I think the things that he went through personally, kind of the dark night of the soul, where he really kind of lost who he was and his way forward. I think if any of us, if you're really digging into life, you're going to go through that. And I can't think of another book that chronicles that journey better than that book. And it has the tragedy of the loss of his daughter, and the way that Bob wrote about that is so beautiful and But, so many of his works, Prometheus Rising, I really love too, and he digs into the psychology of Leary's models and so forth. That was really very, very inspiring to me.
And many people have found that particular book, Prometheus Rising, useful. They've actually done some of the practices. Jeff Deal, I don't know if you've read a lot of Wilson work. We're gonna pass Jeff over for the moment. I will say for myself that there are two things, and I loved Cosmic Trigger, and it changed my life. But I've got to say the Illuminators Trilogy has always been had the biggest eyeball kicks of anything that could be put down on a page, and not didn't have to be put up on the big screen to make you see the weirdest visions that you could possibly imagine. And the other book that I really loved, I think it was called The Widow's Son. It was the second book in that very much underrated trilogy. And I spent a wonderful Thanksgiving afternoon all by myself, doing nothing but smoking a joint and reading that book. And the writing in that trilogy is can bring tears as well as laughter and everything you could possibly imagine. And let's come to Eric Wagner. And Eric, do you have a favorite? And could you tell us which one and why?
Well, I'd have to say probably Prometheus Rising, the revised version. He did that in '97. Again, he sort of takes Leary's ideas, tries to make them practical with exercises and lots of wonderful poetic visions of what life can be like if we start thinking a little bit more on these higher dimensions.
All right. Well, then, on that note, I want to thank everybody for joining us here. And we are going to hear another reading. We're going to close out with another reading. And what are we going to be listening to, Len? This
is the introduction to The Earth Will Shake. So it's the first audiobook we're going to release just a month or so. It's just the opening scene, the first three minutes or so.
All right. Well, we'll leave you with some Robert Anton Wilson.
Are you serious?
Sigismundo Cellini was lost in a dark forest with a red Indian, seeking the supreme Wakan. At the same time, with another part of his mind, he was very aware of everything going on around him in the Cathedral of San Francesco di Paola on this Easter Sunday morning. The trick about getting up early from Mass, Uncle Pietro always said, was to enter into deep meditation, total empty-headedness, so that the mystery of the sacrament could wash over you gently, but not get so relaxed that the people in the adjoining pews could hear you snore. In that deep passivity, Sigismundo was watching the priest prepare for the Holy Communion and still listening to the Indian talking about the Wakan, whatever that was, and not letting his head sink forward to indicate he was half dreaming, and almost noticing the four strangers in black who were approaching the Malatesta pew. "For this is my body," the priest intoned solemnly in Latin. The Latin was similar to the Italian that everybody spoke, and yet it wasn't Italian, but Italian had once been Latin. Somewhere back in time, maybe 600 or 700 years ago, Neapolitans had been speaking something that was half Latin and half Italian, an in-between language. "And this is my blood." Did they know back then that they were speaking a halfway language? And now that the bread and wine were the body and blood of Christ, the mystical presence, Sigismundo found himself wondering about the exact point in time, the instant T in the calculus, when it was half bread and half Christ, the way language was once half Latin and half Italian. And then he saw that the four strangers had taken daggers out of their cloaks and were moving in much faster. He, the boy Sigismundo, came fully awake, thinking it was like one of the overly detailed frescoes of Filippo Lippi. Too much rapid action, too many moving characters, too much color and violence for the mind to comprehend. For the four dark men were all stabbing Uncle Leonardo Malatesta at once, and above them, in perspective, was the priest in his gold and blue robe, and there was he, Sigismundo Cellini, off to the right corner of the Malatesta pew, because the Cellini pew was too crowded. And there, in the new center of everybody's attention, was Uncle Leonardo looking pop-eyed, Like a cuckold in a commedia, the boy thought, as if he himself could not believe what was happening as the strangers plunged their daggers into his belly again and again. And Aunt Gina was falling on top of Sigismundo, the prettiest woman in Napoli, everybody said, screaming with red blood splotching her blue skirts. Then it all seemed to whirl around him for a moment, language changing from Latin to Italian, half-dream becoming awful reality, wheat changing into bread, bread changing into Christ, wheat then becoming flesh, the symbolic sacrifice of Christ becoming the real sacrifice of Uncle Leonardo. He even thought in shame that he was about to retch, because the blood was on him now too, and the priest had been calling for God's blood. The sacrament had become a devil's Sabbath, and instead of doing anything, he was frozen, thinking that Father Ratti at school had explained that the bread was still Christ, even if it fell to the floor and was covered with dust and dirt and muck. And blood, he wondered? Because all physical appearance was accident, and the spiritual essence remained the same, it was still God, whatever the physicality of the accident. You had to understand those terms to pass the final examination in religious knowledge. So, in his vertigo, he thought crazily, "We have come here to eat flesh and drink blood."
Love is the only weapon. Shit! Are you serious?